So I'll just hand it straight over to you.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to First Principles, the life of Joseph. Since it is First Principles, we are just going to be covering the basics of Joseph's life. So if you do know the story of Joseph, it is just going to be a good refresher for you. And if you don't know the story of Joseph, this will be giving you a good basic understanding of Joseph's life and the amazing story that it is. And unfortunately, I don't have a presentation, like a PowerPoint slide for you tonight, so you will have to be using your imagination as I take you through the story. So you can just sit there and close your eyes the whole time if you really want to. Fall asleep. I'm not fazed. If you want to fall asleep, it might make me feel a bit better, even if you want to do that. But to start off, I'll just give you a little background check as to Joseph's family. Joseph has 11 brothers. And I'm going to give you the, in ascending, his oldest brother to the youngest brother, starting with Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph himself, and Benjamin. So Joseph is the second youngest in his family, and his mother's name is Rachel. So let's start in Genesis chapter 37, if you want to open up your Bibles to that. And it says in verse 4 that their father loved him more than all his brethren, and because of this, they hated him. This is talking about all the brothers. All the brothers hated him because their father loved him more. Now, this is where we get into the heart of the story of Joseph. Joseph has his first dream. In verse 5, Joseph comes to his brothers and says, I have a dream. Verse 6 and 7 says, For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose, and also stood upright. And behold, your sheaves stood round about and made obeisance to my sheaf. So the meaning to this dream is that the brothers represent all the sheaves which bow down to Joseph and show obedience. The word obeisance in verse 7 means a sign of submission or worship. And then the next verse, in verse 8, it says that they hated him even more because of this. And in verse 9, Joseph comes again and he says that he has another dream. Verse 9 he says, and he dreamed yet another dream and told it to his brethren and said, Behold, I have dreamed a dream more. And behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obeisance to me. So the second dream is reiterating what the first dream was about, except this time it involves the whole family, including his parents, bowing down to him. And verse 11 says that his brothers envied him. So after Joseph has told his brothers and his family about these two dreams, his brothers decide to make a plan to kill him. So verses 18 to, let me just find out where I am. Where am I? Starting at verse 18, the brothers all plot to get rid of Joseph. So in verse 19, Joseph comes around the corner and all the brothers, they shout, here comes the dreamer. And that word dreamer means the master of dreams, so they're mocking him. And in verse 20, they all come huddled together without Joseph, and they come up with a plan to kill him. And they'll just blame it on some evil beast. And in verse 23, they grab Joseph, they strip him of his coat of many colors that his father gave him, and they throw him into a pit. And while he's in the pit, in verse 25, a company of Ishmaelites come and they're on their way to Egypt. And while Joseph's in the pit, Judah, one of the brothers, gets up and he says, well, what's the point? He says, what profit is it that we slay our brother? What's the point? What do we get out of this of killing Joseph? In verse 27, he says, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites so we actually can gain something other than just killing him. So in verse 28, they sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites for about 20 pieces of silver. Now, 20 pieces of silver is about $200 today. Now, $200 for a brother, maybe worth it, maybe not. Yeah, I've got 3 brothers, a bit more food in the house. Yeah, I can understand where the brothers are coming from, but nonetheless, they sell Joseph, and Joseph heads his way to Egypt. And after they've done this, the brothers take the coloured raiment that they had taken off of Joseph, and they dip it in the blood. In verses 31, they kill a kid, which is a baby goat, and they dip it in the blood of the goat, and they bring it to Jacob, which is the father of all the boys, and they give it to him, and they say, in verse 33, an evil beast had devoured him. Joseph is without doubt rent in pieces. And in verse 34 and 35, Jacob mourned for his son many days. And 35, he refused to be comforted. Now, Joseph is on his way to Egypt, and his father is very sad. So, in verse 36, and the Midianites sold him into Egypt under Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's and captain of the guard. Now, Joseph is in Egypt. However, things start to look a bit more up for Joseph. In verse 2 of chapter 39, it says, and the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man. Prosperous means that he was successful. It says about 3 times that the Lord was with Joseph in the first 5 verses. It says in verse 2, and the Lord was with Joseph. Verse 3, the Lord was with him. And in verse 5, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. However, after this, Potiphar's wife sees Joseph and sort of gets a bit attracted to him. It says in verse 7, that she said, lie with me. However, in verse 8, Joseph denies this. Over the page. And in verse 10, every single day, Potiphar's wife is coming up to him saying, please, please lie with me, please. But Joseph denies every single time. However, in verse 12, she grabs him by his garment. But Joseph runs away. However, he leaves his garment next to her. So while Joseph has run away, Potiphar's wife creates a plan to frame Joseph. It is in verse 16, she creates her own crime scene. It says, and she laid up his garment by her until his Lord came home. So what she does is she's sitting there on her bed. She has Joseph's coat, puts it next to her, waits for Potiphar to come home, and then accuses Joseph of assaulting her. She's sitting there and then just is yelling all these things about Joseph, and Potiphar in verse 20 has no choice but to put Joseph in prison. So now Joseph went from being in the pit to being sold into Egypt to all of a sudden rising to, not quite the top, but rising up to being successful in Potiphar's house, to now being put back down to the bottom in prison. And he's in prison for about a year, in chapter 40, when he's with a baker and a butler, Pharaoh's ex-butler and baker. And they both come to him and they say that they've dreamed a dream. And I'm going to read to you the butler and the baker's dream in the NIV version because it's just way more simpler to understand. So this is the butler's dream in the NIV version from verses 9 to verse 11. In my dream, this is the butler's dream, in my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup into his hand. And then in verses 12 to 13, Joseph responds to him and gives him the interpretation of this dream. He says that the 3 branches represent 3 days, and after 3 days, the butler will be released from the prison and restored to his original position. And since the butler is going to be released from prison, Joseph wants him to mention him to Pharaoh, so hopefully he can get released as well. And since the butler has his dream interpreted, the baker also comes up to Joseph and says, I've had a dream as well. Can you interpret mine too? So this is the baker's dream, also from the NIV as well. Verses 16 and 17. I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. And in verse 18 and 19, Joseph responds and gives the interpretation of the dream. The 3 baskets also represent 3 days. After 3 days, the baker will be taken out of prison as well. However, he will be hung. Now, after 3 days, both of these dreams came true. The butler was restored to his original position, and the baker was hung. However, it says in verse 23 of chapter 40, yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but he forgot him. So Joseph remains in prison alone while both the butler and the baker are released from prison. Then in chapter 41, it opens that the Pharaoh has a dream. And it says that in verse 1 that he stands by a river. Now I'm also going to read this one from the NIV as well, also simply because it's a lot easier to understand. So this is from verses 1 to 4. Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile. When out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. And it says that he had another dream. Verses 5 to 7. He fell asleep again, and he had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the healthy, full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. And it says in verse 8 of chapter 41 that when he had woken up, that his spirit was troubled. And he's asking all of his servants to what was the meaning of his dream, but no one could interpret the dream that he had. And then all of a sudden, in verse 9, this stupid butler suddenly remembers Joseph from back in prison, and he tells Pharaoh about him. So Pharaoh, in verse 14, it says he sent and called Joseph and brings him hastily out of prison. So in verses 15 to 24, Pharaoh tells Joseph about the dreams that he's just had. And Joseph tells Pharaoh that both dreams mean the exact same thing. What the dreams mean is the 7 good cows, or the 7 heads of grain, mean 7 years of plenty, meaning that the crops will grow in great amounts. And the 7 bad cows, or the 7 bad heads of corn, mean 7 years of famine. And in verse 32, it says that the reason that the dream was repeated twice is that it's going to happen very soon. And then Joseph tells Pharaoh from verses 33 to 37 that what needs to happen in order for Egypt to survive the famine. It says in verse 33, "Now therefore let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise and set him over the land of Egypt." Verse 35, "And let them gather all the food of those good years," that's the 7 good years. Verse 36, "And that food shall be for store to the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt." Verse 37, "And the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh." And then in verse 38, Pharaoh gets up and he asks, just out loud, "Well, where can we find someone like this?" And in the next verse, he answers the question for himself. He says, "Well, surely Joseph, you are the man for this job." And in verse 40, Pharaoh anoints Joseph as this overseer of this job. So now, at 30 years old, at the time of verse 40, Joseph is second in command. If we read verse 40 of chapter 41, says, "Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou." Meaning Joseph is second in command. Only Pharaoh is greater than he is. And then in verse 45, it says that Joseph also receives a wife. Verses 47 to 49, Joseph starts to prepare for the famine. And in verses 51 and 52, Joseph has 2 children named Manasseh and Ephraim. And then we have the famine to begin. So the 7 years of plenty has just ended, and verse 53, the 7 years of famine has just started. And in verse 56 of this chapter, it says that the famine was over all the face of the earth. Meaning it's not just in Egypt, it's all the earth. And verse 57, all the countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because that the famine was sore in all lands. All lands meaning including the land of Canaan. And the people to come and buy corn will include Joseph's brothers. Now, in the next chapter, the start of chapter 2, says that Jacob hears about this corn that Egypt has got a lot of store of. So what he does is he sends out his all the brothers to go and get some corn and bring it back for them. However, in verse 4, he says, of chapter 42, he doesn't send Benjamin because he doesn't want any risk or of anything to happen to Benjamin. And in verse 6, Joseph's brothers arrive. It says, Joseph's brothers came and bowed down themselves before him with their faces to the earth. This is Joseph's first dream being fulfilled. However, in verses 7 and 8, his brothers didn't know who he was. And since they didn't know who he was, Joseph took advantage of this. Joseph suddenly remembered all the dreams that he had previously and the way that the brothers treated him. So he decided to do this. Verses 9 to 12, he accuses them of being spies. But the brothers pleaded and begged that they aren't spies. In verse 11 it says, "We are true men, thy servants are not spies." Joseph responds to them by telling them to prove their innocence by bringing their youngest brother. In verse 20 it says, "But bring your youngest brother unto me, so shall your words be verified, and ye shall not die." And while this is happening, Joseph is putting on this persona, this fake personality, to ensure that they don't know who he is. So he's being extra hostile towards them. He's driven by this anger. He's blindsided by this anger because of what they were doing to him before he was sold into Egypt. And in verse 21 and 22, the brothers start saying to each other that this is happening because of what they did to Joseph, but they still don't know that they're talking directly to Joseph. The NIV says, "Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come on us." Verse 24 shows that Joseph is slowly beginning to break character. It says that, "And he turned himself about from them and wept." However, he returns to them, he brings his composure back, and suddenly takes Simeon from them and puts him in prison. Then he sends them all on their way, puts corn in their sacks, sends them home and tells them to bring Benjamin back, otherwise he won't release Simeon from prison. Then, if we go over to chapter 43 and verse 15, after they brought Benjamin all the way back to Egypt, Simeon still remaining in prison, Benjamin is now standing in front of Joseph. Now suddenly, Joseph's whole demeanor has changed. And in verse 16, Joseph saw Benjamin and he says, "Bring these men home and slay and make ready, for these men shall dine with me at noon." So he's going to make a big lunch for them. And in verse 23, at the end of verse 23, and he brought Simeon out unto them. So he releases Simeon from prison. And even in verse 24, he does all these good things for them. He gives them water, he washes their feet, and he even feeds their donkeys. And the brothers exchange gifts with Joseph. And verse 27, Joseph asks how their father's doing. He says, "Is your father well? The old man of whom you spake, is he yet alive?" And in verse 28, after all these conversations have been happening, the brothers bowed down their heads and made obeisance. Obeisance is the exact same word that is used in the first two dreams. After they've bowed their heads down, Joseph looks up and he makes eye contact directly with Benjamin. Once he makes eye contact with Benjamin, it says in verse 30 and 31 that Joseph almost just can't handle it anymore. It says in verse 30 and 31, "His bowels did yearn upon his brother, and he sought where to weep, and he entered into his chamber and wept there." Meaning that he had to go to a completely separate room to just bawl his eyes out. And in verse 31, "And he washed his face and went out and refrained himself." So he had to, once again, keep his composure, go back out and see his brothers again. So once he goes back out, he says, "All right, let's have lunch." And they did. And verse 34, "And they drank and were merry with him." So they all had a lot to drink together, and they got very drunk all together. Then chapter 44 comes along, and you would think that Joseph is now starting to get a little bit happier with his brothers being here. However, Joseph decides to have a plan. In verse 2 he says, "Put my cup, the silver cup, in the sack's mouth of the youngest," meaning Benjamin, "and his corn money, in the sack's mouth of the youngest, and his corn money." And he did according to the word that Joseph had spoken. So the next morning comes, Joseph's servants stop the brothers as they are leaving and accuse them of stealing. They all deny and they say, "Whoever has it can die, and the rest of us will be your slaves." So in verse 12, they search Benjamin's sack and they find the cup. So they return to Egypt. However, verse 17, Joseph decides to change the punishment. It says, "But the man in whose hand the cup is found, he shall be my servant." So instead, only Benjamin will stay, and the rest can go home peacefully. But after Joseph says this, Judah gets up, and from verses 18 to 34, Judah gives this massive, elaborate speech to Joseph about how he needs Benjamin to come home with him, otherwise he cannot break the news to his father. It would have been a really big emotional moments for both Judah, Benjamin, and Joseph to hear. And it was such a big emotional moment that in chapter 45, Joseph could not control himself so much, and in verse 1 it says, "Then Joseph could not refrain himself before all of them that stood by him, and he cried." And verse 2, "And he wept aloud." And verse 4 of chapter 45, he said, "And Joseph said unto his brethren, Come near unto me, I pray you. And they came near, and he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom ye sold into Egypt." Now, he finally reveals himself unto his brothers in Egypt. And after he's revealed himself, he tells them, "Please don't feel bad about this. Please, I need to see my father." And he says in verse 13, "And ye shall tell my father of all my glory in Egypt, and of all that ye have seen, and ye shall haste and bring down my father hither." And while all this commotion is going on in Joseph's house, Pharaoh actually hears it. And it says in verse 16 that Pharaoh is pleased to hear it. And Pharaoh actually invites all of Joseph's family to come and live in Egypt. It says in verse 16, "And the fame thereof was heard in Pharaoh's house, saying, Joseph's brethren are come, and it pleased Pharaoh well, and his servants. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, Say unto thy brethren, This do ye, lade your beasts, and go get you unto the land of Canaan, and take your father and your households, and come unto me, and I will give you the good of the land of Egypt, and ye shall eat the fat of the land." And then in chapter 46, verses 6 and 7, they do exactly that. And they took their cattle and their goods, which they had gotten in the land of Canaan, and came into Egypt, Jacob and all his seed with him, his sons and his sons' sons with him, his daughters and his sons' daughters, and all his seeds brought he with him into Egypt. And Joseph and all his family lived together in Egypt. And then finally, in chapters 50, verses 26, Joseph dies in Egypt at the final age of 110. Now, I understand that this is a very simplified talk on Joseph's life, but given it is a first principles talk, this is the basic understanding of what I feel is needed to know about Joseph. And if there was any lesson that I figured that is needed to be taken out of the story of Joseph, it is that no matter what circumstances come about in your life, it is to have faith and put trust in God that he has a plan and purpose for you, and he will make your paths straight. And that is the life of Joseph.
Well, thank you for that, Brother Ollie. So, as a bit of housekeeping, that was our final of the 3 first principles from Genesis talks. And next Wednesday, we will have our brother Jack Lawson on Haggai. And did you want to do any questions, Ollie? You finished pretty early, so there's time. We might talk about it over supper. So if you bow your heads, we'll just say a quick prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we come before you now at the end of our night together, so thankful for this opportunity that we've had to revisit the account of your servant Joseph, and to ponder what lessons might be hidden for us in his life. We thank you for this spiritual food that you provide us with, as we also thank you for the temporal blessings that we are about to enjoy together. Please be with us now as we depart for our homes, and keep us in safety until we meet again, or until our Lord returns. We ask this in his name. Amen.